and welcome to our ongoing discussion of issues of importance to the Caucasus. I'm Dr. Joanne Lisosky, author and journalism educator. Today, I'm joined by Thomas De Waal, Senior Fellow with the Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. He's also a journalist and author of The Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War. And that's exactly where we happen to be right now. So he's the perfect person to be talking to us. The state of the Black Garden, or Nagorno-Karabakh region right now, is war. For a month, serious fighting has killed numbers of as many as they say 5,000 people, including women and children. We've seen 3 ceasefires brokered by powerful nations, Russia and the US. All 3 of these ceasefires have been broken almost as soon as they began. The conflict may be a long, protracted fight over territory. My question for you, Tom, my first question is, what does it mean that the 2 superpowers have been powerless in negotiating a ceasefire? What is the alternative strategy if arm twisting by these 2 countries isn't winning the peace?
Sure. Well, thank you, Joanne, for the chance to talk to you. Yes, in fact, there have been 3 ceasefires and a third one we should mention, which France tried to broker, which is also the 3 main mediators in this conflict going back to 1997. So there's almost a rather dark symbolism there that the 3 mediators have each tried to broker a ceasefire, and each time it's failed. I think the answer is relatively simple. I think one has to look at the frustration in Azerbaijan, and we can obviously discuss how justified it is, what Azerbaijan itself could have done to further a peace process. But frustration in Azerbaijan that there wasn't a peace process, and with the Armenian leader Nikol Pashinyan, a belief that they had better military technology now, crucially the support of Turkey, and therefore it was time to change the status quo on the ground by force. And each time, obviously we don't know the details sitting here, but it's pretty obvious that the Armenian side is pretty desperate. They've been suffering loss of territory. The status quo has turned against them. It's pretty clear that they wanted a ceasefire. So it's pretty clear that the Azerbaijani side has resumed fighting because they see the objectives getting closer. They've now recaptured more or less 4 of the 7 regions that they lost in the 1990s, and they're moving towards the Lachin corridor, which is the link between Karabakh and Armenia, at which point the conflict would, if they do that, the conflict would escalate again and enter a whole new, I think, quite dangerous phase. But if you just look at the scenes from Azerbaijan, you see the massive public support for what's happening, despite the heavy casualties that Azerbaijan is suffering.
So there has been, media have reported from both sides that the other side is the one that broke the ceasefire, particularly the last one. And is there any way of knowing where truth actually lies, or does it depend on where your family came from? Or
I think there isn't any way of knowing, but I think we can be logical here, and I think we can say that Azerbaijan really, it's not in its interest to observe a ceasefire when they have all the military momentum behind them, and I think one should just look at the statements by the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry and by the Azerbaijani president. He gave a speech the day after the Washington brokered ceasefire, where his foreign minister had gone to Washington, and in that speech it was a very patriotic, quite aggressive speech about the recovery of territory, challenging the Armenians. He didn't even mention Mr. Trump and Mr. Pompeo and everything that had happened in Washington. It was as though it hadn't happened in that speech. So I think that tells you really what's going on. But obviously, this is not the issue for Azerbaijan. They are also sending the message that they believe that the United States, Russia, and France have failed them and have not delivered peace. Obviously, they would say peace on their terms, and obviously there are two sides in this conflict, but that is very much the Azerbaijani message.
So correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't that speech also talking about a timeline, sort of trying to negotiate a timeline or ask for a timeline as well, the president?
Well, I mean, when the Azerbaijani side talks about a timeline, it's a timeline basically for what they're saying is for an Armenian surrender. They're talking about the withdrawal of military forces from Karabakh, which obviously is unacceptable to the Armenians. The Armenians say those military forces are defending the Armenians of Karabakh from destruction. So clearly that's a kind of non-negotiable point. And we should also mention that you know, up until recently, and maybe we can talk a bit about this, there's been this international framework for how the framework plan for how this conflict could be solved. It's called the Basic Principles Framework, and that clearly, you know, mentions has many competing ideas which form this framework. One of which is the non-use of force, and the other one is the right of self-rule of the Karabakh Armenians. So one reason why this conflict started, you can take a look at the recent New York Times article by Thomas De Waal, my old friend and colleague who's just been in Azerbaijan, giving a quite a sophisticated take on the Azerbaijani view of this conflict, is that as far as they were concerned, the Armenian side, Nikol Pashinyan, had walked away from those basic principles, and there was no point. They'd run out of road in negotiations, and I think, you know, that they certainly have a point there. What we're seeing now, of course, is the Azerbaijani side also rejecting those basic principles. They're using force. They're no longer talking about the kind of self-rule that is in the basic principles, and they may be poised to cut the corridor between Karabakh and Armenia, which is also one of those principles.
So I want to talk a little bit about the Russian engagement in this. Why has Russia been so cautious to intervene? It seems like they have not been reticent in the past to intervene with other former Soviet countries. So suddenly now they're being a little bit hands-off on this. Why would that be?
Well, I think there's quite a bit of misunderstanding about Russia's role in this conflict. I've been saying for years that Russia's role is a bit overestimated, that they're not pulling the strings in this conflict. This is a conflict basically between two sovereign states, each of which Russia has a fairly good relationship, obviously a military relationship and quite close relationship with Armenia, but also really quite a strong relationship with Azerbaijan as well, and particularly the elites in Russia and Azerbaijan, I think, see eye to eye much more than the elites in Russia and Armenia. So Russia's always had a bit of a balancing act in this conflict. It's supported one side or the other. It's also, as it were, kind of tried to maintain the military balance in a rather cynical way by giving weapons to either side. So while there's been this kind of equilibrium, and Russia has managed to maintain this equilibrium, Russia has maintained its influence with Baku and with Yerevan. But on the other hand, it's had no military leverage. It's got a fairly small base in Armenia, but no troops in Azerbaijan, and no peacekeepers on the ground, which it used to further Russia influence in the other conflict zones. So this equilibrium was maintained over many years. But as soon as one side, in this case Azerbaijan, had bought the weapons and got crucially the support of Turkey to challenge that equilibrium, to change the balance, suddenly Russia was left very exposed. It has a military treaty obligation to the Republic of Armenia. If the Republic of Armenia comes under attack, Russia is obliged to defend Armenia, but that does not extend to outside Armenia. It does not extend to Karabakh. And so Russia has basically been in this awkward situation where its reputation is damaged because at home, certainly, because it's not seen to be doing anything to stop this, and yet it knows that if it does intervene, basically that means going to war with Azerbaijan, and for many reasons that's a red line Russia doesn't want to cross, and quite sensible reasons. I think it would be very dangerous, extremely dangerous for Russia to go to war with Azerbaijan.
You mentioned earlier the basic principles and the agreement. I'm wondering, can this agreement ever really be brought back onto the table again? And how is the fact that Azerbaijan has regained a portion of the territories, how is that going to affect that basic principles?
Yeah, I think the basic principles are now over. They were formed, as it were, to reflect the status quo post 1994, and I think they were actually a good plan. They were a kind of liberal. The trouble is, as my good friend Lawrence Broers puts it, they were a kind of liberal peace document, which was trying to be negotiated, but in an authoritarian fashion. They were based on rights and principles of all sides, but they didn't really have any engagement with society, and they were basically being negotiated mainly by Russia in this very kind of authoritarian way. So they never really had any traction. Do they have much future? I don't think so. I mean, obviously, let's see what's happening on the ground. I think it's very important for us to look at where this is going. If Azerbaijan has obviously recovered now several of these territories which it lost, which were pure Azerbaijani administrative regions, which were under Armenian occupation. No one has ever disputed that these are should 100% go back to Azerbaijan. But the fact that Azerbaijan is now pushing into Karabakh itself, which is the disputed territory going back to 1988, going back to 1920, we could say, the disputed territory at the heart of this conflict, where there are very, very strong Armenian claims to self-determination. The fact that Azerbaijan is now pushing into that territory obviously means we're entering into a new phase where there will be stronger Armenian resistance, where the Armenians will not give up the fight. Even if there is a sort of quote-unquote military defeat of Armenia, the Armenians will not give up the fight for Karabakh. This territory has incredible historical importance for them. So I don't know, the question really is to what extent Azerbaijan itself, perhaps in consultation with Turkey, how far Azerbaijan wants to go down that road of trying to recapture or capture, some would say, Karabakh itself, a territory that it's basically had as an independent country has never had control of. This I think is what's unclear at the moment, and what everyone is looking at very closely.
So I want to talk a little bit about what you just said too. You agree that the territorial integrity means that this area does belong to Azerbaijan, the territory surrounding Karabakh.
I mean, the conundrum here is basically that Soviet borders became international borders in 1991, but for many of these territories which happened to fall inside these new borders, this arrangement had no legitimacy. That as far as they were concerned, you know, in this case, as far as they were concerned, the Armenians of Karabakh thought it was an arbitrary decision taken by the Bolsheviks in 1921, which had no legitimacy. Why should they put up with it? And so obviously there's the very important principle of territorial integrity, which I think is a kind of basis to start with. But then this is a case which is crying out for extremely high autonomy and respect of the rights of the Karabakh Armenians. But because there was no democratic culture in the Soviet Union, this never became possible. It just became a pure security issue. Who could grab the territory and keep hold of it? First of all, the Armenians, as we saw in the 1990s, and now possibly Azerbaijan. So I think the international response is basically, sure, this is the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan, you know, has to make a very, very strong case that they would respect the rights of these Armenians, and they're not really doing very well for that case at the moment, in the way they're attacking Karabakh itself by taking villages, in some cases renaming those villages with Azerbaijani names, and attacking civilians in places like Stepanakert. So this is obviously what we're looking at now. But God help anyone who wants to try and restart negotiations, because where do you start from, to be honest?
Well, you talked a little bit about the bombing of civilians, and that's been definitely verified to happen in Ganja and in other places. And it's well documented that Armenia has hit several Azerbaijani cities away from the battlefield, not even near Karabakh. And these bombs have killed Azerbaijani women and children. Now, the world generally finds the shelling of civilians to be highly distasteful. And illegal, yes, illegal by Geneva Conventions.
Yeah.
But why this military tactic from the Armenians?
Yeah, I mean that's a very important question. Obviously, I've been just referred to the shelling of Armenian civilians in Karabakh, which has been going on for several weeks now. I've seen figures of up to about 50 people killed by that. But we've also got same numbers, if not more, in Ganja, Teter, Barda, these Azerbaijani towns. Why is that being done? Is it one has to look into the minds of people who are pretty ferocious, pretty desperate. Are they doing that in order to for revenge, quote unquote? Are they doing it in order to try and provoke Azerbaijan to attack Armenia, to draw in Russia? You've also seen the explanation that there are military bases in these places, and that the attacks have just been inaccurate and have missed their target. Who can know? But certainly, I think we really need to, as internationals, hopefully foreground the human rights aspect of this, and that there shouldn't be a culture of impunity where civilians are targeted and no one stands up for them. So that there should be, as far as I'm concerned, incredibly important that there should be an international and partial investigation of all the alleged war crimes carried out during this conflict.
I need to talk a little bit about the idea that surrounding economic issues here. We've got two countries that have very varied economic security right now, and oil and gas are significant factors in the region. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, no pipelines, I believe, have yet been touched. Might a disruption of pipelines or any kind of bombing of any kind of economic situations like that bring in a host of other national players and would cause maybe more problems for Armenia?
Well, I mean, we're looking at some fairly bad scenarios here, but you're right to mention this issue. It's no secret that various Armenian commanders have periodically said that if Karabakh comes under attack, we will try and target pipeline infrastructure. They've also mentioned the Mingachur Dam in Azerbaijan, which would be, again, that would be a big war crime that would cause catastrophic flooding if that was destroyed. So as for pipelines, clearly, I'm sure they're fairly well defended, but sure, if there was disruption to pipelines, that would also bring in a host of actors, including some European nations who are currently receiving Azerbaijani gas. So, yeah, not a good picture at all. I mean, more broadly, one has to say that the economic damage of this conflict is pretty grave. That also, we should also mention the COVID pandemic, because both countries had been struggling to cope with it, and I've seen pictures from Karabakh of people in cellars huddled up together, and talk of massive COVID spread in these bunkers. I'm sure it's the same situation in some of these shelters in Azerbaijan. So that's an additional problem, which is, as it were, kind of racing behind the war.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the bombing in the residential areas. So do you suggest that these bombs that went to Ganja were not supposed to be targeted on the residential areas?
Well, no, I don't. I mean, who can tell? I mean, that's one an investigation. But I mean, some Armenians have been saying there were military bases in Ganja, that they were targeted at military bases, and they missed their target and hit civilians. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just pointing out that you know, and similarly, Azerbaijanis have been saying, you know, it wasn't deliberate targeting of civilians in places like Stepanakert. So who can tell? You know, it's very hard to get information, but it does suggest the need for some kind of international investigation into this.
I agree. I want to talk a little bit about France, a significant member of the Minsk group that has been outspokenly leaning toward Armenia. How can any country, and of course Russia has the base in Armenia, has the military base, small military base in Armenia. The US, there's been some rhetoric out of the US, and certainly the US diaspora has sort of pushed the US to sort of be on Armenia's side. How can we possibly expect these countries in the Minsk group to fairly negotiate when they've made it pretty obvious that they're in favor of Armenia? Is it possible?
Well, I would qualify that a bit. I think France is in a big row with Turkey at the moment, and that's, you know, clearly coloured what's going on in this conflict. Having said that, President Aliyev, you know, has also said that he accepts the French as an impartial mediator. He said that in a couple of interviews. But I do agree with you that I think it would be helpful, and you know, the Minsk group format, co-chairs format, I think has not worked very well for many years, and that I would personally favour a broader format involving some other European nations, possibly Germany, possibly Sweden, which has quite a long interest in an impartial interest in this conflict. So I think, you know, these are all fair points. I think Russia obviously is a bit of a dishonest broker in this conflict. It has its own agenda here, which was really also about getting peace, but also getting Russian peacekeepers into the conflict zone. So I think it was trusted, certainly not trusted by Azerbaijan, but actually in a way not trusted by the Armenians either as well. So I think all of this speaks to the fact that there should be some, if and when, and I hope we do, that gets back to some kind of negotiations, it should be redone with a new format. But having said all that, I mean, I think I do want to push back against the idea that the mediators have failed this conflict. Mediators mediate. Mediators do what they can with a conflict situation, a conflict dynamic. We've got two countries and two nations, Armenia and Azerbaijan, which are locked in this almost existential struggle for 30 years with completely competing claims about Karabakh, really very strong rhetoric, almost dehumanizing rhetoric, you know, claims of absolute security. And, you know, if one was to get, I don't know, Mahatma Gandhi and the Dalai Lama to try and negotiate between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I don't think they would have pulled it off either, and I'm sure they would be denounced on each side for supporting the other. So I think we have to sort of, you know, emphasize that mediators can do what they can only with the material that they work with, and the material they work with in this conflict is two incredibly polarized positions.
You spoke a little bit about this. You sort of led me to this question about modern warfare actually being waged with words and images often, and increasingly now social media as well. And what about some of the rhetoric? Much propaganda has been espoused on both sides. Armenians crying genocide, Azerbaijan speaking of preserving the motherland. How do we sort of get past all of this rhetoric to try to determine what is actually going on? Or where do you acquire your information?
Well, I mean, obviously there are people on the ground, and you know, there are in some, once you get past this incredible wave of propaganda. There are some sources out there. If there are some good journalists on the ground, there are people like Human Rights Watch or the ICRC who are impartial. But it is tricky, and certainly Twitter is a horrible place where hate speech is just filling the atmosphere. I feel this personally because I'm someone who tries to be fair, tries to be impartial in the middle, and is constantly being attacked, which is very unpleasant. And everything I say, is dissected and misinterpreted usually. So it is a problem because you want to have a kind of, as I call it, a third narrative out there, which is about how peace and compromise is possible, like it is in any conflict, as long as if people start to feel a bit of empathy for one another, understand that they maybe should work together to resolve this conflict. But that's in the world of Twitter and social media and these horrible images which are being traded back and forth. That's incredibly difficult, and I don't know that I have a solution to that. I don't know anyone has a solution to that, to be honest.
It sounds like a good idea, social media, right? That we would have someone who could do crowdsourcing and find out what's happening. But I read one journalist from Azerbaijan yesterday who said she's not sure there's anybody there who isn't on one side or the other. And
you see, I think, Joanne, I think there are actually people who actually have much more nuanced views. But how do you express a nuanced view on Twitter unless you have a thread that is 40 tweets long, which no one is going to read? That's one thing. And also, what's the upside for being nuanced and creative on Twitter? You're just going to be exposed yourself, unfortunately. So, and interestingly, on Twitter, some of the same people I've had people have been attacked me in public and then written me fairly nice messages in private. The same people, but they just don't want to be seen to be nice to me in private. That's
really interesting. Some have called this not a top-down, but a grassroots conflict. Mm-hmm. We know citizens on both sides are highly supportive of their nation's military actions. And in fact, this story that you mentioned, the New York Times article said in fact, this was the Washington Post article, says that these countries are gripped with war fever. Mm-hmm. How can the leaders of these countries prepare their people for a ceasefire or any kind of negotiation?
Well, that's a great question. Clearly the Armenian side, I think, is desperate for this to stop. They look pretty exhausted. I'm sure they will fight for every last inch of Karabakh, to be honest. But I think they're pretty desperate for this to stop. Although I think Nikol Pashinyan, the Armenian Prime Minister, has handled this incredibly badly. He's basically been, talking about, again, defense of the motherland, fighting. He's not really. He should have been, in my view, talking for unconditional negotiations. As for Azerbaijan, I think this is a real issue. I think President Aliyev may have, at the beginning, anticipated that he would take back a couple of regions with some difficulty and call for new negotiations and call a halt. But the military operation has gone pretty well for Azerbaijan. So he's now riding this tiger in which the whole nation, as it were, standing up and cheering him on. And he may see the dangers of going further, but now the nation is behind him. They want to see a kind of Azerbaijani flag flying over Shusha. And maybe that's now the Azerbaijani goal, with all the dangers that implies, because of having a war deep inside Karabakh itself and all the bloodshed that would bring. So I think clearly this is an incredibly bad conflict for Nikol Pashinyan. I think Armenian solidarity will mean that he will probably stay on until things get quiet, but I don't think he can survive this politically. He's made so many mistakes. But equally, I think Mr. Aliyev should be a bit worried that the whole nation is mobilized now, and they're not going to just stand down. And I think that mobilization will probably may now extend into domestic politics. So, sure, if he'll be a hero for a while, but in maybe 1 year or 2 years, that mobilization could extend into domestic politics. There could be, people now asking some of the serious questions about corruption, about economic mismanagement, and so on that they haven't been able to ask over the last few years.
If you had the ear of President Aliyev, what would you tell him? What would you advise him at this point?
Well, it'd be a bit presumptuous of me, but I would say, if he was to call a halt now, then the international community could have no quarrel with him. Well, they could quarrel some of the attacks on Karabakh and on civilians, but they would have no quarrel saying that he is basically, that the Azerbaijani army has basically liberated recaptured lands that were lost, and no one has any doubt that they belong to Azerbaijan, and negotiations could resume on a much more serious level. So I think, it could. There are some pretty bad scenarios out there, clearly for the Armenians, but also for Azerbaijan as well. The longer this goes on, possibly some kind of Russian involvement, dangerous as that might be, much more bloodshed. I mean, Azerbaijan has obviously not been releasing its military casualty figures, because I think once it does, it's going to be a huge shock to the nation, the idea that maybe several thousand people, young men, have died. And also the possibilities of, as we've already discussed, of Armenian retaliation. So if we talk about that there was Armenian hubris back in the 1990s, the way that they said we've won a military victory, I think Azerbaijan should also beware of hubris now, to try and pursue a full military victory. I don't believe there can be a full military victory in this conflict, which, after all, goes back a whole century.
What about Prime Minister Pashinyan? What would you say to him at this point?
I'd say call for unconditional negotiations. Absolutely try and put an absolute stop on any Armenian strikes on Azerbaijani towns. Just, speak up for peace. He obviously can't admit he's wrong, but he's made many mistakes. But try and unwind some of the many mistakes he's made.
Well, let's hope they take some of your advice.
I don't think
they may listen. Well, it seems like many analysts like yourself and experts in the area have made similar suggestions, that people that I've talked to have made similar suggestions, that it's time to slow down and think about how war is the very worst negotiating tactic there happens to be in the entire world. Well, thank you, Tom De Waal.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.